Heat up. Here. So, we wrapped up the development of the destroyer series throughout history, but with a slight exception of the active part of World War I, which I might go back and revisit at some point. But then the wonderful folks over on Patreon decided that they wanted a bit of a coda to that series. Namely to take a brief look at the gun-based destroyers that were built in that really narrow window that the channel covers of post-World War II but pre-missile age, which I roughly define as the Korean War, but is subject to a little bit of flexibility here and there, especially in this video where we'll go just a little bit into the 1950s. Now, this will probably be slightly shorter than some of the previous videos, or at least the list of ships covered will be slightly shorter on account of there being, well, no German or Japanese destroyer development since with the end of World War II, the only thing that their destroyers were doing was repatriation voyages and then being shipped out to various other countries as war prizes. Now, yes, technically the Japanese would actually start building destroyers to their own design again in the mid-1950s, and they would build multiple classes of these ships all the way up to the late 1970s, all without any kind of missile armament, but in parallel with the construction of larger missile-armed. But since there was a 10-year break in local destroyer design plus the fact that a good chunk of those ships are regarded as more of large escorts of the destroyer escort or frigate type rather than frontline destroyers because, well, they weren't intended for the traditional or the developing frontline destroyer roles. I'm going to leave them to somebody who covers somewhat more modern vessels. Italy, though, will make a brief appearance, as they did manage to get back to building their own destroyers somewhat more quickly, largely on account of having bowed out of World War II somewhat sooner, but weirdly also then taking longer to actually sort out peace treaty. But that peace treaty was less punitive than the ones that were enforced on Germany and Japan. Any case, let's start with the UK cause that's quite easy. They only built one class. Although the battle class represented a return to the full-size fleet destroyer. After the various war emergency flotilla classes and the weapon class, it's all forward main battery, at least in its first iterations, as well as various other compromises made in layout, showed that what had at the start of World War II been a fairly large destroyer hull in the immediate post-Tea Treaty world, also known as the tribal class hull and its various derivatives, which had underpinned a lot of UK wartime destroyer construction, had well and truly been surpassed in utility, along with ever-improving versions of the 4.5 in twin mounting which now came in a lighter upper deck version instead of the heavier between deck version. It was decided that the 1944 destroyer program would include an improved fleet destroyer design as well as an accompanying smaller version which would be a successor to the weapon class, which could then be built in smaller yards. This latter class, the abortive class, was briefly covered in the previous video, so we'll focus on just the fleet destroyer here. This new class started out as simply putting a third twin 4.5 in mount on the aft end of a 1943 battle class hull and then trying to play with the machinery to fit it into a less space-efficient but much more survivable unit system. But at the same time, issues were cropping up with the battle-class ships that were under construction, and so it was decided, well, let's try and go for a clean slate design, as that would have much more room for upgrades and refits over its projected lifespan. An internal set of specifications was thus issued that incorporated the above features, and so you can imagine the surprise when this new sketch design came in. Not at a little bit more than the just under 2,500 tons of the 1943 battle class, but at over 000 tons. More at 312,000 tons, a 40% increase in displacement. This created something of a minor panic at the increased costs and size of such a vessel, and the designers were then told, no. A maximum of 2,750 tons standard displacement is acceptable. Into that somehow was to be fitted 3 twin 4.5 in dual-purpose mounts, a pair of quad-torpedo launchers, a scattering of 40mm Bofors mounts, and a Squid anti-submarine projectile launcher. Ideally, all of this would be moving at a file clip. While everyone was trying to figure out just how exactly this could be done, there were suggestions that maybe the treasury might be even this mild increase in size. Questions swirled. Well, the new upper deck mount was considerably lighter than the older between deck mount. So why exactly had there been that big jump in size when the restrictions had been taken off? Well, it seemed that the people asking these questions had forgotten that there was also the demand for the unit machinery with the boilers and turbines separated and alternating, and just how much additional hull volume that needed and subsequently increasing displacement had seemed to drop by the wayside. Plus, of course, it was all very well saying there's enough deck space to stick an extra gun mount aft, but you also need some clear space around said gun mount so as not to damage equipment or injure and possibly even kill crew that were manning said equipment with the gun blasts, which required considerably more clear deck space than just what you needed to stick the gun there. After some argument, a design was suggested that did in fact have the 6 main guns along with 4 twin 40mm buffers mounts that were entirely self-reliant with their own radar and fire control systems. These were known as Buster mounts and were the predecessors of the Stag mounts. And I say Stag because it had 2 A's in it. This would be accompanied by around a dozen 20mm Orans, 2 quintuple torpedo launchers instead of quads, and the Squid launcher. All of this came in at just over 2,700 tons standard displacement, but this particular version of the design did not include the unit system for the machinery. Some of this armament was then downgraded to try and give the ship better stability as well. There was an awful lot of it up on the upper portions of the ship. But all this accomplished was everyone calling to increase the weaponry again, especially the anti-submarine loadout. This led to a search for other ways to reduce the weight, introducing newer and lighter machinery, lowering the height of the decks slightly, moving various stores, especially liquid stores, to below the lowest deck plating between it and the hull, widening the superstructure to reduce its length and give you more deck space, and various other measures. In theory, this managed to drop the displacement by about 150 tons while restoring the absolute minimum level of desired armament. But soon enough, the threat of even lower displacement limits was in fact enacted. And now, with only 2,500 tons allowed, the design found itself back at being around 100 tons overweight. This then led to the elimination of the big and heavy Squid anti-submarine launcher system in favor of a large number of depth charges, which brought the ship to just about on the new target displacement, albeit at the expense of being considered a true frontline anti-submarine warfare vessel, as it wasn't thought the depth charges had much use against future submarines. From here, though, the design in principle had tacit approval, and so it inevitably started to grow again. 2 twin Bofors mounts became 3, having been cut down in half originally in exchange for the loss of 4 of the Oricans, and the Squid was reinstated towards the end of 1944, replacing the 10 depth charge launchers that had been put in its place completely. There was also a brief move to try and fit no less than 3 quintuple or pentad, if we're using correct Royal Navy terminology, torpedo launchers plus reloads and reloading mechanisms in the light of experiences over in the Pacific, where the Japanese had been enjoying quite a lot of success with their heavy torpedo armaments. But after quite a lot of back and forth, this was relaxed back down to the pair of quintuple launchers and no reloads, largely on account of a lack of space on the ship. The unit system, however, also returned. Each of the ship's 2 boilers and 2 turbines were paired into a single combined machinery space each, so 1 boiler and 1 turbine in each space. These 2 machinery units were then placed in the hull some distance apart from each other, which of course meant that 2 funnels would be needed, one of which was happily rather easily semi-cons concealed since it came up inside the lattice mast just behind the bridge superstructure, which itself had been significantly expanded to allow for the possible, although as it turned out not actually carried out, installation of fighter direction equipment. This W space was allocated assuming that a new radar that at the time was in development would be able to be successfully deployed to the fleet at some point in the future in a size and shape that could fit on the destroyers. At first, it was planned to build 2 8-strong flotillas for a total of 16 with an order for an additional 4 ships for a total of 20 in all, which would be to a slightly modified design. Coming from the Royal Australian Navy, as these would be using the even newer Limbo launcher in place of Squid, dropping one of the torpedo launchers as a result, and using somewhat different 40mm buffers mounts. Although they retained the 6 barrels in total, all the 20mm Oricans had vanished at some point during these latter design stage revisions. But one of the Australian ships and one of the British flotillas ended up being cancelled, which meant that a total of 11 ships were actually built. 8 British and 3 Australian, with a type being dubbed the Daring class, named after the lead ship. They proved capable of around about 35 knots, although their exact quoted top speed remained somewhat contentious, as although the ships in the class were capable of around 35 knots on trials, the Royal Navy at the time was undergoing something of a minor obsession with exactly how it classified speed. They wanted to take into account if the ship was fresh out of dock or if it was heavily fouled. Was it operating in cold seas or warm seas? Was it running alight? Was it running heavily loaded, or was it running normally loaded? And was this a sustained top speed, i.e. it could maintain the speed until it ran out of fuel, or was it a speed that was only really sustainable for a shorter period of time? And so as a result, you'll see different quoted top speeds ranging from 30 to 35 knots depending on which particular condition the writer of that article or book has actually looked at. And that was it for British gun-based destroyers, as the next British destroyer program was to be the County class, which featured, among other things, the Sea Slug missile, or as I like to term it, the weaponized remains of the British space program. And as such, it falls well outside the realms of this channel. A large number of export destroyer designs were drafted, but most of those efforts founded in large part due to interference from other government departments. And the sole successful exported destroyer design was the Almirante class, which was sold to Chile. These are also gun-based ships, but they were products of the late 1950s. That brings us on to the Americans. The U.S. Navy would receive 3 classes, technically speaking, of gun-based destroyer in the post-war environment, although interestingly in ever-decreasing displacements, but accompanied by more and more hulls. First class started off as a response to the discovery and examination of the capabilities of the German Type 21 and Type 23 electroboats, as well as various notes on the Walter Drive submarines that they'd been derived from. This led to a conclusion that a future escort ship could take one of 2 forms. One would be an evolved version of the mass-produced destroyer escort. This could be made in numbers and could surround a convoy or fleet with a sonar ring that could in theory prevent such new submarines from getting close to the big targets. But they couldn't do anything other than passively defend. The subs would be far faster underwater than current or future destroyer escorts could sustain in anything other than a flat calm. Even then, simply matching a submarine speed in good weather didn't actually let you chase it down. The other option was to build a ship large enough to have both the speed and range to chase down even a submarine capable of 25 knots underwater, which was the anticipated speed of the next generation of submarines. And it would be able to do this in almost any weather. Combine that with enough fuel to actually stick around with a convoy or a fleet for a meaningful amount of time, and these ships would be big and expensive enough that only a handful could be built. Only a few of them could be built. Then they would also need to be able to defend themselves against all other potential threats. It was also pointed out that a large escort could use much larger propellers. These would displace considerably more water per revolution than standard destroyer-grade propellers, which would allow for fewer revolutions per minute for the same speed, which would make sonar operation, especially in a chase, much easier. The initial specification was centered on almost entirely around the anti-submarine mission. A pair of twin launchers for deep-diving homing torpedoes with 1 launcher per side, each equipped with at least 2 sets of reloads. Some form of gun battery was specified only notionally to be capable of dealing with surface submarines. That was about it. And a trio of Weapon Alpha anti-submarine warfare rocket launchers. Speed would be around 35 knots, which would give a 5-knot speed margin over a 25-knot submarine, even in foul weather, which would of course cut overall surface speed. But as we said, the gun armament was at first surprisingly anemic, just a pair of twin 3 inches being considered in more than enough to deal with a surface submarine. The assumption was, at least at that stage, that aircraft carriers and more general-purpose destroyers would do most of the job of air cover. There was, however, significant pushback from several departments on this front. Some officers pushed to double the 3 inches battery. Others wanted to include some form of medium anti-aircraft armament like 40 mm buffers. Still others pointed out that placing the anti-submarine warfare torpedo tubes on the center line on pivoting mounts would allow for a single torpedo fire control system to govern the whole torpedo setup. And still other officers were opposed to the Weapon Alpha and torpedo tube installations in general, preferring to reserve the deck space for something called the GRE, which was a prototype torpedo-carrying missile or drone depending on what book you read, which was supposed to allow for long-range attacks on detected submarines by carrying the torpedo to the destination. This differed from the later ASROC in that the GREB actually used full-on wings. So it was actually a mini aircraft with a torpedo attached. A variety of options were presented. 1. Used a version of the whole that was being prepared separately for the new fleet destroyers, which we'll discuss next. 2 other designs acknowledged, well, the sheer size of the proposal by just going like we're just going to use the hull of the Atlantic class cruiser as the starting point. Although the larger designs would cost about 50% more than the smaller one, it was thought that it was more likely that the larger hull would be able to maintain speed in really rough weather more reliably. It would also be steadier in rough weather, and it would have much greater capacity to take future upgrades. And so, it was decided to proceed with the larger version, which at this point now had 3 twin 3 inches mounts and no less than 10 fixed torpedo tubes, 5 per side. Series of design revisions were then undertaken, which ultimately yielded a ship that for the moment carried a new hull designation. TLK, a sub-killing light cruiser. It displaced a little over 6,600 tons. Now had 8 torpedo tubes, 4 Weapon Alpha mounts, and 4 twin 3 inches guns, along with 4 twin enclosed 20 mm Orans. Hull strength and freeboard were increased to allow for 30 knots running in the worst sea conditions. Significant reserve stability was built in just in case operations might have to take place in Arctic waters with considerable ice buildup. And provision was made in the design of the deck camber, the edges of the deck and the superstructure to account for the possibility of nearby nuclear blasts and subsequent decontamination sprays. 2 ships were ordered in 1948, but the costs were so high that the first ship, USS Norfolk, was laid down on its own in 1949, as her sister was first delayed and then cancelled entirely on the grounds of the rather eye-watering $62 million per ship cost. That doesn't sound like much now, but back then it was the equivalent to around 4 of the World War II-era Gearing-class destroyers, as there'd been a bit of inflation between World War II and the end of the 1940s. And it also meant that, accounting for inflation, these things cost about half as much as an entire Iowa-class battleship. As a result, Norfolk spent most of her career as a test bed ship for various systems that would then be fitted onto other classes en masse. And so instead of more Norfolks, attention switched to a smaller and hopefully somewhat cheaper class, the Mitches, which had been rumbling along in one form or another since almost the start of U.S. involvement in World War II. You might think that sounds a bit far-fetched, but back then the beginnings of the Sumner and Gearing design process were actually being paralleled by a thread of thought that took account of the new higher speeds of U.S. capital ships like the Iowa-class battleships, and sought to maintain the speed advantage that the interwar and Fletcher-class destroyers had possessed over the rest of the fleet only with relation to these new faster ships. This design at first called for a 2,000-ton ship that would be capable of 38 knots, armed with a new 5.54 caliber gun and a large torpedo battery. This latter was included in view of the success that Japanese destroyers were having at the time off of Guadalcanal. Most of these ideas were batted back as too expensive, too impractical, or taking far too long to implement. But the idea would surface again in 1944 as considerations for a post-war destroyer fleet were being made. At this point, the idea was to do an even longer version of the gearing, which, remember, itself was basically a longer version of the Sumar class with an aim for a 40-knot trial speed, which they thought would translate in service to a reliable speed of about 38 knots. However, even at almost 3,800 tons, such a ship would either attain the desired speed but have a hopelessly short range, or it would have to have the fuel tanks arranged in such a way that some of them could be drained without needing to be filled again with water for ballast. While this latter idea would allow the ship to reach 39 knots, it would only be able to do so once the tanks began to empty and the ship lightened considerably. With a full set of tanks, it would only be able to do about 36 knots. The drive for these exceptionally high speeds was perhaps being somewhat enhanced by the presence at the time of a number of free French super-destroyers in U.S. ports, which were of course capable of somewhat ridiculous speeds, albeit under the hood at massively shorter ranges than any Pacific-orientated U.S. Navy would ever accept. But by the end of 1944, most of the U.S. Navy's senior officers, when pled, declared that they preferred a 35 to 36-knot ship with considerably more endurance than a faster, shorter-range vessel. Although a few were holding out for 38 knots, and some of them were even asking for reloadable torpedo tubes. This resulted in a long series of options that would be discussed as the war ended and then into the first few years of the late 1940s. Initially, this destroyer was going to have 10 torpedoes and a pair of quintuple launchers, plus a battery of 3 twin 5" 54 caliber guns, a trio of twin 3" guns, either a 50 caliber or the new 70 caliber, plus some 20 mm Oricans. This was then replaced by 4 twin 3" guns of whatever caliber, instead of the Oricans, and 3 twin mounts. And the ship would have more range under this revised design, but with standard displacement jumping from 2,600 to 3,300 tons. The Bureau of Ordnance popped up partway through to suggest that maybe they could invent a double-stack 10-tube mounting, which could then replace the 2 quintuple tubes without any loss of firepower, but which would take up considerably less deck space, and thus that deck space could be used for other weapons. But shortly after the end of the war, although displacement was creeping higher and higher, the idea was floated to just drop the anti-ship torpedoes entirely in favor of a pair of twin anti-submarine torpedo launchers with several reloads each. And the twin 5" 54 caliber guns were to be replaced with single 5" 54 turrets, which used a newly developed auto-loading system to match or exceed the fire rate of the manually loaded twin mounts. Additionally, with a switch from surface action to anti-submarine and anti-air warfare, the guns went from a pair of mounts super-firing forward and one aft to just a single mount forward, which allowed for a greater rise of hull and thus better seeping, and 2 aft. The weapon Alpha anti-submarine warfare rocket launcher was also introduced in various numbers and placements on various revisions in these post-war designs. Displacement on a wide range of options varied from between 3,300 tons to almost 3,800 tons standard, depending on the exact speed that particular option was going to go at, and latterly whether or not it would be carrying the massive SX air interception radar, which would allow the ship to also be used as a radar picket. There was a brief diversion into a smaller craft, armed gun-wise at least, with only a couple of twin 3" described primarily as a sensor platform to enhance other ships' capabilities with only limited self-defense capability itself. But design variant J-13 attracted the most attention. This was to displace 3,650 tons standard with a pair of single 5" 54 caliber guns, a pair of twin 3" guns, initially a 50 caliber, later 70, 2 weapon Alpha launchers, and a pair of twin anti-submarine torpedo launchers. This was considered to be fairly attractive as it would be primarily an anti-submarine warfare escort, but it would have one of each type of gun mount at each end, and thus it could in theory engage 2 completely separate sets of targets. One of them could even be in the air and the other could be in the sea. A few 20mm Orans were thrown in, just in case power failed somehow and all the bigger guns were frozen in place. This design would become the Mitch class. But despite being cheaper than the Norfolks, well, almost anything was cheaper than the Norfolks, only 4 would be laid down. Partly because, well, they were still quite expensive. And partly because the newer 3 inches 70 caliber guns just weren't available yet. They would be installed in the mid-1950s. The ships also trial the 1,200 psi steam plant, and those boilers proved somewhat troublesome in service. While all this had been going on, a number of departments had seen the writing on the wall and had started to work on something that could be built in larger numbers and represented something of a more balanced design. Essentially, in their own words, trying to make a new Fletcher class instead of a new Gearing class or some new concept. This started out as Design SCB-85. Ostensibly a 2,500-ton ship with 3 single 5 in 54S, 4 twin 3 in 50S4. Fixed torpedo tubes for whatever torpedo you could stuff in them, a pair of Hedgehog launchers and various depth charges, but with a much reduced speed requirement of just 32 knots. Other suggestions from other departments for this mass-reduced design included 1 or 2 weapon Alpha installations, some 20mm Olicans, and at one point, somebody wanted no less than 26 anti-submarine torpedoes, 4 in the 2 twin launchers and then 22 reloads. After some closer design work, it was realized that even if you have of the 3 inches battery to just 2 twin mounts, you couldn't facilitate the SCP-85 requirement on 2,000 tons. But if you did half the 3 inches battery, it would be possible to meet all the other requirements on 2,800 tons. This significant change in priorities reflected a shift from submarine hunters that could brace away from the fleet and chase down submarines to their heart's content to a more prosaic, strong, and capable escort vessel which could support the fleet, which would then be supplemented by large numbers of World War II destroyers which were converted to almost exclusively anti-submarine work. This design would then become the 18-strong Forrest Sherman class, which would see very long service with the U.S. Navy, with a number of small changes being made during their production run along, with a series of more substantial changes made during various refits and conversions as time went on. 2 of the class, the USS Edson and the USS Turner Joy, survive to this day as museum ships. But this would be the last class of U.S. Navy destroyers that would depend primarily on guns, as the next class would introduce surface-to-air missile systems, even if admittedly only partway through the production run, as the first 3 of the subsequent Farout class initially didn't have the Terrier missile launcher. And that brings us on to the French. In the aftermath of World War II, the Marine National was left with an assortment of ships, some ex-German and ex-Italian war prizes, plus whatever was left from their own pre-war fleet, while it was clear that quite a lot of this needed replacing either almost immediately because they were worn out or basically unsuitable for further service, or perhaps would need replacing in the short-term future to rationalize on the sheer number of different spare parts that were needed. The recovering French government had limited funding, and almost all of France's naval infrastructure had either been bombed, sabotaged, bombed, allowed to degrade, bombed, or bombed a lot, and thus needed extensive work itself to be repaired and put back into service. And so in 1946 they decided they were going to design a new ship that would be something of a step back in size and speed from the pre-war Contratopolier. Instead, they decided to use the U.S. Gearing class as a starting point. However, with a number of the designers of the pre-war fleet still around, this starting point remained only very notionally such, and the T-47 or Seraph class was rapidly drawn up with some very clear influences from early war French destroyer programs. 3 options were presented and one was rapidly chosen. Propulsion on this option came in the form of 63,000 cheval vapor or CV, a French measure that's roughly similar to shaft horsepower, which was delivered by 2 sets of turbines driving a pair of screws. The boiler and engine rooms were separate and independent for survivability, but it was possible to cross-feed steam from one boiler room to both turbines should one of the boilers be disabled for any reason. On paper, they were designed for a sustained speed of 34 knots, although at light loading when on trials, they proved somewhat more capable of a decidedly more French 38 to 39 knots. Although being armed with half a dozen 5-inch guns in 3 twin turrets like the Gearings, these guns were French 127mm, 54 caliber semi-automatic guns, and they were positioned the opposite way round to the Gearings with a single turret forward and a pair super-firing aft. This was originally going to be the 130 or 5.1 in gun of pre-war French design, but the design had been altered down to 5 in so that it was able to use the rather plentiful supplies of U.S. Navy 5-inch shells that were available at the time, although with a separate French charge. These were dual-purpose weapons with an 80 degrees maximum elevation, and they were backed up by 3 more twin turrets, each mounting a pair of 57mm guns which were themselves scaled-up 40mm Bofors. 1 turret super-firing over the forward main battery turret and then 2 more just after the funnel side by side on a pedestal mount, which meant they were at the same height as the aft super-firing main battery turret, which was itself some way further down the length of the ship. A handful of single 20mm Zorans were included for good measure. No less than a dozen torpedo tubes in 4 triple launchers were included, but these were split. There are a pair of full-size at 47 launchers mounted either side of the ship aft between the 57mm pedestal and the aft main battery, which fired primarily anti-ship torpedoes, while a pair of shorter KT-50 launchers were designed to fire mainly a heavy anti-submarine warfare torpedo, and these were mounted further forward between the 2 funnels on either side of the ship. The heavy ASW torpedo was a bit of a weird halfway house. It was fast at 50 knots, and it carried a very large warhead, but it also had no homing device, just a variable depth setting, and some reloads, the idea being to spam 3 of them at once in a fan at whatever depth you'd set them for. Indeed, the French themselves called these things self-propelling depth charges, though in some ways you could see them as a horizontal running version of the Limbo or Weapon Alpha systems, although homing torpedoes would later be equipped on the ships. Extensive radar and sonar suites were installed, and 12 vessels would be built over the course of the early 1950s, with the majority serving into the 1970s and 80s. Although in the 1960s the class would be split into 3 subclasses, as 3 of the ships were made flagships, which involved losing their forward 57mm twin turret, the 2 anti-submarine warfare-only torpedo launchers, and some of the Oricans in exchange for considerably larger superstructures which could then house an admiral and his staff. 4 other vessels became anti-aircraft missile ships, replacing the main battery turrets and the anti-shipping torpedo launchers aft, with a Tarta missile launcher and a heavy anti-submarine mortar mounted forward. The final 5 vessels became dedicated anti-submarine vessels, replacing their entire existing armament except for the anti-submarine torpedo launchers, with a pair of 100mm automatic guns, 1 forward and 1 aft, a 6-shot anti-submarine rocket launcher forward, and a Malafon anti-submarine missile system aft. One of these ships, the I believe it's Males, serves today as a museum ship. These would then be followed in the late 1950s by the T-53 class, a modified version of the T-47s, of which 5 were designed to escort the new Clemenceau-class aircraft carriers, and a 6th Legalis Honneur would be a test bed for modern anti-submarine weaponry. The main production run would, apart from radar suites, appear almost identical to the T-47s when seen from the bow. But after the shorter anti-submarine torpedo launchers above the funnels were gone, The off-torpedo launchers could now carry either anti-shipping or true homing anti-submarine torpedoes, and then between them was a 375mm 6-barrel anti-submarine rocket launcher using the same Bofors anti-submarine rockets found on Swedish destroyers like Small Land at the time. Each quarter-ton rocket could be launched at a rate of 1 per second, followed by a 90-cond reload for the entire launcher as there were still more rockets in a magazine below. Lugge. Elisier, meanwhile, would be the pioneer of the Malafon anti-submarine warfare missile, which would later be fitted to many of the T-47s. And as well as this, she would have a small flight deck, a quad-barrel 305mm anti-submarine mortar, the same two full-sized triple torpedo tubes of her half-sisters, and a pair of single 100mm guns up front plus the aforementioned missile system. A couple of these ships would be refitted in the 1970s to serve in different roles, but all subsequent French escort warships would then be built centered from the start on some kind of missile system. The Italians started their post-war navy by replacing most of what was left of the existing destroyer stock with repurposed ex-US Navy destroyers and a pair of reconstructed Capitania Romani-class light cruisers, which were refitted as particularly large and fast destroyer equivalents dubbed the San Gio class. But as they started out as cruisers, they don't strictly fall into this video's remit. Instead, the last Italian gun destroyers would be the two strong Impetuoso class of the early 1950s. This class used the wartime Command Medagoro Italians' design as a basis, but reverted to the classic Italian 4 guns with one twin mount fore and one after layout. Only this time they were using US 5 inches 38 twin mounts since, well, there were plenty of those going around. 16 40mm Bofors were also installed in 2 quad and 4 twin mounts with 1 quad and 2 twin mounts down each side, with the twin mounts roughly speaking abreast each funnel, and the quad mounts on a pedestal which overlooked the aft 5 inches turret. This was supplemented by 2 triple torpedo tubes, one on each side between the funnels, although those were soon replaced with fixed launchers for anti-submarine torpedoes. Some depth charges were included, but the main anti-submarine armament was a rather impressive-looking 12 inches anti-submarine rotary barrel mortar that was mounted in a super-firing turreted position behind the forward 5 inches 38 turret. 2 of these ships would be built and they served on until the 1980s. And that brings us finally to the Soviets. These will have to be pretty brief descriptions as I wasn't able to find all that much reliable information about them. But for the sake of completeness, the Project 30 Ognavoy class straddled the World War II period for the Soviets, with the first being laid down before the war and the last being laid down afterwards. And so in the aftermath of World War II, they were left facing a NATO naval force, which included hundreds of modern destroyers and equivalents. And so to speed things up in their own production lines, they created Project 30 BIS, which was essentially a Project 30 or NAVOE with the minimum needed changes to install somewhat more modern equipment, designed to be built like the Type 21 U-boat in mass numbers thanks to prefabricated sections. They displaced just over 2,300 tons standard and were armed with a pair of twin 130mm single-purpose guns, one turret forward, the other aft, a twin 85mm anti-aircraft mount super-firing over the aft main turret, and 7 single 35mm anti-aircraft guns. Torpedo armament increased to 10 thanks to having a pair of quintuple launchers. But beyond some mines and depth charges, the initial version of these ships was not especially well armed for the post-World War II environment, although they did carry quite a few radar and sonar systems, especially for their size. Dozens of these ships were built, and many would later be modernized with heavier anti-aircraft guns, anti-submarine rocket launchers and the like, but they were only ever really intended as a stopgap to bring Soviet fleet numbers up to scratch. Ideally, they would then have been superseded by the Nowostraszemy, or Project 41 class, a larger 3,100-ton ship capable of 36 knots, although still using a pair of twin 130mm gun mounts. These were now fully dual-purpose models. And this was combined with a pair of quad 45mm anti-aircraft batteries and the same pair of quintuple torpedo launchers plus anti-submarine mortars and depth charges to make a reasonably decent immediate post-war destroyer, albeit one with perhaps a little too much focus on anti-capital ship warfare compared to most other designs at the time, which, as we've seen, were looking more and more anti-submarine and anti-aircraft warfare. But either way, it was decided that the one ship actually built was too large and too expensive for mass production. So it remained as a test bed, while a slightly smaller version, the Kotlin or Project 56, was devised. This dropped displacement down to just under 2,700 tons standard, at least on paper, while retaining the two twin dual-purpose 130mm gun battery, upping the power plant for a speed of 38 knots and increasing the anti-aircraft battery with another pair of quad 455mm batteries, along with the 10 torpedo tubes. You might be wondering, how on earth did they pull off that using a smaller and lighter hull? Well, the answer was that the range was cut significantly along with onboard stores capacity. This, along with lighter versions of various guns, extensive use of light metals like aluminium in the hull and in the superstructure, and extensive use of welding and prefabrication all helped. But ultimately they would still come in somewhat above the 2,700-ton standard weight target. In theory, the class offered a number of easy upgrade routes, especially if the extensive torpedo and medium anti-aircraft armament was subsequently replaced by more modern systems. After a production run of 27, the construction of the class was stopped as the first Soviet missile systems were ready to be mounted on warships. Although these weren't surfacito-air missiles like you saw in the West, but surfacito's surface missiles. And so, as we said, production was halted in favor of a ship that could carry these new weapons. Now, some of the vessels would later be modified to carry surfacito-air missiles of their own, mainly by ditching one of the torpedo launchers with a medium anti-aircraft batteries changed to various new guns and anti-submarine rocket launchers being installed. The last of these ships would survive to the end of the Cold War. And that wraps up our speedrun look at the last gun destroyers of the major navies built in, roughly speaking, the decade after the Second World War. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry do questions.